Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to our campus today. I'm Bonnie Jones, the Regional Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs here at the University of South Florida, Sarasota, Manatee. And I think that this topic is one that really does need to be discussed, debated, and what better place to do that than a university where we discuss ideas like this all the time. I want to give my personal thanks to Kathy Black, who is a professor of social work here on our campus. Dr. Black was very instrumental in bringing this forward, and a lot of her work is in the aging arena, and she's a well-known expert nationally and internationally on that. So thank you, Kathy, for this. Since some of you may have never been to our campus before, I'll tell you just a little bit about us. We've been in the area 40 years, believe it or not, almost. But a lot of people didn't know we even existed until this campus was built. We were sharing a campus with New College, and we've been on this campus now about 8 years. We have over 40 academic programs. We have all the way from freshmen that we accept to transfer students from State College of Florida or other community colleges and state colleges around, transfers from other universities, and we also have master's degree programs. We have a College of Arts and Sciences, a College of Business, a College of Education, and Hospitality and Technology Leadership. With that, I think we serve about 2,400 students a year who call Sarasota Manatee their home campus. But we have a number of online courses, so we do have students from the USF St. Petersburg campus and the USF Tampa campus take courses with us as well. So we serve close to 4,500 students a year on this campus with about 70 faculty and about 120 staff. So just to give you a little bit of background on us, and with that, I have the pleasure of introducing Bill Church from the Herald-Tribune, editor, who will introduce this very distinguished panel on this very serious and important topic. I hope that we come away with a little bit of better understanding of it. I don't know that we're going to come up with total solutions, but whatever side of the fence you're on, I think that this discussion will be very important and maybe life-changing for some of us. So with that, Bill.
Thank you, Bonnie. I'll be very brief. When Carrie Seidman approached us about this story, and it was late last year, we knew that the story would resonate with readers on a lot of different levels. What we wanted to do today more than anything else was to bring folks together to have a Q&A to discuss the issues more than anything else. I want to thank USF Sarasota Manatee and also the Sarasota County Public Library System for being unique partnerships in this really first-of-the-kind effort by the Herald-Tribune to provide that face-to-face reaction engagement to a story. So without much further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie Seidman, who is going to moderate this panel. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A. Just a little housekeeping. For those of you who have a hip-hop ringtone, we don't want to hear it, so please put your phone on mute. And we will have time for Q&A after we get some comments from the panelists. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, everyone, for coming today. It's really great for me to see this many people here and to see the response to the story, because although Dorothy was my friend and I was thrilled to be able to write about her fascinating life, the intent of the story was really to get people thinking about and talking openly about their end-of-life planning. And I know Dorothy was very motivated to see that happen as well. So it's great to see you all here. I am no expert on end-of-life issues, so I'm very grateful to have here a very distinguished panel of people who have given their time this afternoon to help us out and answer questions. And I'd like to introduce them briefly and then give them each an opportunity to say a few words about their particular area of expertise. And then we'll leave the majority of the time this afternoon for you all to get your questions answered. So to my left is Kathy Black. Kathy has been introduced already, but I'll give you a little bit more. She's a geriatric social worker and a professor of social work and gerontology here at USF, where she teaches a very popular course on death and dying. Her research and writing has focused on advanced planning for the end of life for both elders and healthcare professionals who provide for them. She's also been a nurse and a social worker in acute, long-term, and home settings. And Kathy was integral in getting together the people for the panel, so I especially thank her for that. Next to Kathy is John Griffin. He's a partner in the law firm of Griffin & Griffin and is certified by the Florida Bar as an expert in elder law. His practice includes elder law, estate planning, guardianship, asset protection, probate, elder law litigation, and special needs planning. He has served on numerous committees, including those protecting nursing homes, residents' rights, and public benefits for elders. Next to John is Dr. Joelle Langston. She's the Chief Medical Officer for Tidewell Hospice in Sarasota. She's a certified hospice administrator and is board certified in pediatrics, internal medicine, and palliative medicine. She's an active member of the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine and serves on multiple committees in our medical community, including the Bioethics Committee. And down at the end is Miriam Lasher, who recently retired from Sarasota Memorial Hospital, where she was an administrator and a psychotherapist in the Department of Psychiatry and a manager with the Bayside Center for Behavioral Health. Miriam has presented on a wide variety of behavioral health issues and continues to co-chair the Bioethics Committee for the hospital. And I just want us all to give our appreciation for them giving their time today. And now starting with Kathy, each panelist will have a few minutes to talk about their particular area of expertise and the critical issues in that area. That may give you a better idea of who to direct your questions toward when we get to the Q&A. So we'll start with Kathy.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I want to just thank our USF Sarasota Manatee team who put this room together today for us. So Mark Keller and Brian Mudd, Frank Spinelli, and Ruth Lando. So thank you to all of you. And Emmy Television, thank you for taping this so that this can be viewed to a broader audience. Bill Church from the Sarasota Herald-Tribune, thank you for bringing this to this community. And Carrie, thank you for your wonderful journalism and sharing Dorothy's story with us. My name is Kathy Black, and I'm a gerontologist here. I study planning in advance for care in all of life domains. Just a week ago, we had planning for financial incapacity and also planning for housing needs. We also plan for caregiving. End of life is part of that, and so we also are involved in planning for end of life as well. And in fact, most of our work is on helping people live fully throughout the end of life and focused on that. I think today's forum is very important. I think it's very important to think about issues of death and dying. For the next hour, we hope to enhance your reflection and by talking about death. As a society, we can't even say the word. There's about over 100 euphemisms to talk about death and dying. We talk about somebody passed away, they're gone. We don't even say the word die. So for the next hour and a half, I'm really glad that we're able to talk about it in this room, because when you leave this room, you'll be back out in society where the subject will be very taboo again. But your thinking and talking about it will help break that down. I want to ask a few questions to people. And that is, have you ever considered how you would like to spend the end of your life? Your last hours, your last days, where you want to be, who do you want to be there with you, what medical care you want or don't want, who is best to represent you if you're unable to represent yourself. Mortality statistics suggest that about 10% of us die suddenly. A CVA, a pulmonary embolism, a heart attack, an accident. But 90% of us will face a deteriorating health course ranging from anywhere from a few weeks to months, years, and even decades of declining health, inevitably leading to our death. So throughout that course, people will experience a variety of things: reliance on medical care, pain, loss of control of bodily functions, which greatly impact their dignity and independence, their ability to communicate and process information. And people differ greatly on how they face those aspects in later life. For example, many people want to die at home, and yet about 75% of us will die in institutional settings, hospital or nursing home. Among those dying in acute care, about 75% of those will die after they've made a decision to forego medical care. In the institutional setting, you will lose control of your last days. We have stories of people bringing in pictures of their loved ones only for the families to come in, and the pictures are removed from the bedside because they're in the way. Limited visiting hours. My friend lost her father, her father died. Her father died. Yes, he was lost, and her father died a few months ago, and at the time of his death, The Price is Right was blaring on the television of the roommate. That is the death experience for many people in this country. People receiving unwanted care right up until the end of life, all the sights, sounds, and rhythms of hospital life, and many people dying alone. Now, some people want control over the setting in which they die. Other people want control over the process and the outcomes as well. Now, we define a good death as a death that's on one's own terms. But if you are not involved in thinking and planning for this, that may not happen for you. And we like to say that there are good deaths, but there are also bad deaths, and there are horrible deaths. And I don't think I need to tell anybody in this crowd about some of the stories for horrible deaths. So how do we ensure control over our own death? The system is replete with everything to keep us alive long after a natural death would ensue. Doctors are part of that. The entire medical profession is trained to, and they're in the business of saving lives. And so I believe it needs to be driven by people, and all of you are here today to hear a little bit more about that. Underneath much of this is our discomfort and fear of talking about these issues. So what are the end-of-life dying planning options for people? Well, the traditional ones are advanced care planning. Many of you are familiar with advanced directives. In 1991, the Patient Self-Determination Act required the hospitals and healthcare providers to ask older people, people over age 18, whether they have an advanced directive or whether they'd like one. And there are other directives, such as the medical orders for life-sustaining treatment, and we happen to have in our presence today Deborah Dobbs, who was involved in the planning committee for the state of Florida in trialing out medical orders for life-sustaining treatment, which is done in a few other states. Many of you are familiar with the Do Not Resuscitate order. Some of the other options that we have are palliative care, which is diagnosis-driven, focusing on quality of life and pain management. Hospice, which we have Dr. Angstrom here, the medical director of hospice. She will discuss hospice with you shortly. It is an underutilized benefit. The average length of stay in hospice is a few weeks. It is prognosis-driven. Some of the non-traditional options for people are, we have 5 states in the nation with physician-assisted suicide: Oregon, Washington, Montana, New Mexico, and Vermont. And there are countries that have high doses of opioids that will also lead to your death. They are in Switzerland, Colombia, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. We also have in our presence today Jim Chastain, who is the president of the of the Final Exit Network for the state of Florida. and they use helium as a form of effective ending of your life. Some of you, there are limits to all of those options I just mentioned, and the limits are that you need to have a terminal condition. So what has happened are many people taking death into their own hands, active euthanasia, people who are stockpiling medicines. And by the way, those medicines can make you sick, and you can end up with liver failure. They may not be effective. Suicide rates among older white males are the highest rates in the nation. So we know that many people are ending their lives this way. So the option for the rest of people who want to end their lives in the absence of a terminal illness is voluntary stopping eating and drinking, VSED. It is passive euthanasia. It is seen as a way to preserve one's autonomy and maintain control and hasten one's death. I know that it seems incomprehensible to many people who can't imagine taking their life in such a manner. The definition of VSED is the conscious and deliberate decision by a capacitated person, and we're all assumed to have capacity, to intentionally refrain from eating and drinking with the explicit purpose of hastening your death due to unbearable suffering, which, by the way, is not just physical suffering, but existential suffering as well. And who better to determine that than for each person authentically to determine that for their own life? People choose this option to control the circumstances surrounding their death. When they're ready to die, if they're experiencing a poor quality of life, life is no longer worth living. All subjective factors. It takes about 2 to 4 weeks. The sensation of thirst is managed by just wetting the lips. People need to be managed with comfort measures, and people caring for them need to be prepared for what happens in the final stages of life. You know, we're so removed from death and dying that we don't know what dying people look like and what the care needs to be. Lastly, and I know that I'm spending just an extra moment here, but I do want to share with you that I contacted some of the nation's experts on this. And specifically, I contacted Charles Sabatino, who's the director of the Commission of Long and Aging for the American Bar Association, and he said that VSED is not prohibited in any state, and that people have the capacity to make that decision as long as they have the capacity. And again, we are presumed to have that. He also directed me to the work of Thaddeus Pope, who is a legal expert on VSED, and I shared that with John Griffith, and the work is quite amazing. Not only is it a contemporaneous decision, but he also says that it's a non-contemporaneous decision, that you can decide to choose VSED in advance, for example, of a dementia, and that should be honored as well. He even goes so far as to say that surrogates who know what the person wants can do that. Those are legal experts in the nation. Ethically, I contacted, how many of you know Arthur Kaplan? National leading bioethicist. He's written back to me on several times about this issue, and he has assured me that that as long as people have capacity, that they have the right as well. And I also spoke with Ken Goodman, who's the director of the Flora Bioethics Network. And so here we have the legal and ethical weigh-ins on this issue. And in closing, a longer life is not necessarily a better life. We need to offer compassionate and support for individual choices, legally, ethically, and I think we should be prepared to discuss some of the safeguards for some of these options that we are going to see more of in the days ahead. With the aging baby boomers focused on living life to their fullest, about 77, 78 million of them, we're going to see more of these options in the days ahead. Thank you.
Kathy. Thank you, Kathy. John, we'll turn it over to you.
All right. I've been asked to discuss with you all a little bit about the legal implications of VSED, but also about medical self-determination in general. And we're talking exclusively about Florida here. And Florida courts are pretty clear on the matter of medical self-determination. The Florida Supreme Court has ruled that every individual has the right to determine their own medical treatment and what happens to their body. We find that law really based as a starting point in the Florida Constitution. What is commonly referred to as the right to privacy is sort of equivalent with the right to liberty and the right to choose one's own interactions, what happens to your body and your mind. And so Florida law has recognized the right, say, to remove life support, artificial nutrition and hydration, as a right that you can exercise under that right to privacy. So really this is rooted, when you are competent, in the Florida Constitution. You see this in cases of Jehovah's Witnesses who choose to refuse medical treatment. There's some other religions where medical treatment is refused. And the courts have consistently upheld that you have the right, while competent, to decide to accept or refuse medical treatment. You could go further and argue that this is also in the United States Constitution. The court has spoken on this matter but not ruled on it, meaning they've sort of expressed their opinion without a judgment, where they indicate that that right to medical self-determination, in their opinion, might be held in our rights to privacy and liberty under the federal Constitution as well. In Florida, the courts have gone further. There's a seminal case, in re the guardianship of Browning, in which the court ruled that an incompetent person has the same rights after incompetency that a competent person would have. So the part of the discussion today, I imagine, will be what happens when you're no longer competent to make the decision to refuse treatment. Now, that may happen in two circumstances. One, talked about someone who's incompetent before the decision is made to terminate voluntary feeding, or it could be in, for example, Dorothy's case, incompetence occurs during the course of the voluntary withholding of treatment. So, in reading Carrie's article, you can see that Dorothy didn't remain competent probably through the entire process. Certainly at some point when she was unconscious, she could no longer make decisions for herself. And what obligations and rights do surrogates have in that scenario to step in and intervene? And so, I think it's an important part of the process that we address what happens at that moment where someone goes from being voluntarily refusing food to involuntarily refusing food because they lack the ability to consent further but are still living. And so I would love to tell you that I have the answers to that question, but the reality is the law is still very gray on that matter. I think it's well established in the law that you can participate in voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, but when that switches to the authority falling on someone else, it is a much grayer issue. In order to avoid or to implement these rules, the law allows us to create advanced directives for healthcare and living wills. And I want to point out that those are two separate things. An advanced directive for healthcare is equally important, in my opinion, if not more important than the living will. Because the reality is almost all of your medical decisions that are going to be made by your healthcare surrogate under your advanced directive for healthcare and not your living will. The living will is narrow in scope in that it deals only with, in Florida, when you are in one of three conditions. And I'll let the doctor talk more about that because she knows more than me. So but the conditions are limited in when a living will is going to apply. Before that, your advanced directive for healthcare is going to be the individual making all of those decisions. So if you are interested in VSED as an option for yourself, and I'll be honest, this article has encouraged me to reevaluate the way we're addressing this in our office, it may not be right to have it simply in your living will. Because the living will isn't triggered until those very last moments of life, it may be something you want to explore separately or in your healthcare directive. In those moments before you're in a terminal condition, an end-stage condition, or a persistent vegetative state. So you may not want to wait until those last moments to implement VSED if that's something you're interested in. The other question that I think is unsettled is, does hand feeding constitute medical treatment? So in all of the advanced directives, we're sort of putting on that the assumption that it's medical treatment which the surrogate can decide for you. And the question is, does physically putting food in your mouth constitute medical treatment? There is some basis, again, it wasn't ruled on by the federal Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, where Justice Rehnquist at one point said it seems odd that we would say sticking a needle in your arm is somehow more intrusive than sticking a spoon in your mouth. So there is some indication that both the physical action of sticking something in your body, whether it's in your arm or your mouth, would constitute an intrusive action. where the federal Supreme Court may at some point rule on that. Right now, I would say we're still in a gray area as to whether hand feeding does constitute medical treatment. I would tend to say that I think the law is leaning more towards yes than no, and we'll talk about a few reasons that is, but it certainly there isn't a case or a law in Florida that's going to settle that issue outright. As you all know, I'm sure, that we are the state that created the Terry Schiavo case. And so Florida is well entrenched in the issue of sustaining life. And so I think you find in our law a little bit of back and forth because there were a lot of advocates both ways. And as you know, this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which is rare for an end-of-life case. But there was a lot of push in Florida to declare food necessary, not an optional medical treatment, but a required one. Ultimately, that was settled in favor of allowing Terry Schiavo to pass without food and water. But again, for that case to get the Supreme Court shows that Florida is sort of a battleground state for this issue. And, you know, a case like Dorothy's is probably more rare than common. And so the way that this has worked is there's not a lot of law on it. You know, Dorothy's passed before any intervention was done. So there's no case to step in, no one to step in and stop that from happening, and therefore no results in the courts. Your advance directive should be written and not simply oral, although oral directions are permissible under the law. If you intend to do something like V said, I would strongly encourage you to have written documents. I mean, in my opinion, everyone should have them. But certainly if you're going to attempt to do something outside the normal bounds, if that's not written, your chances of mounting the legal, you won't be here, your surrogate's chances of mounting the legal battle to intervene is going to be much more reduced, because the law is going to probably side or may side on the side of life versus death when there's some question about your intention. So I would strongly encourage you, those of you here who are considering any alternative options, to have those written very explicitly. I've been using some version of a VSET authority in my living will for about a year, maybe a year and a half. So it's a relatively new concept even in my practice. I had a client come to me who worked in a nursing home and had seen for 30 years and 40 years the effects of illness and aging and doesn't want to be hand-fed. And so our living will, we can provide to our clients an option to refuse voluntary hand-feeding, drinking. It's their opinion that when they reach a certain point, they don't want to be force-fed. Now that does require, again, the designation that they're in a certain medical condition. It's not voluntary in that sense. It's the person lacks capacity to make the decision themselves, and the surrogate is implementing their rights like they did for Dorothy. But again, the question arises, is that going to be honored? And the reality is, I don't know. I mean, that's what I tell my clients when they ask me, am I going to be able to do this? Nursing homes are rightfully, and doctors are rightfully concerned about honoring that kind of direction. There is clear federal law that requires facilities to provide nutrition and hydration on a daily basis to residents in their facilities. But there's also law that says a resident can refuse treatment. And so I would argue, if I was representing a facility, that the obligation probably exists to continue to offer food, but is not their obligation to force feed someone against their wishes. So what the legal argument for that would be is that force feeding, the physical touching of another person against their will in a way that would be offensive to them, is considered a battery, and it's a crime. So just like walking up to you in the street and spitting on you would be a battery, an unwanted physical interaction which is offensive to you. If someone has voluntarily chosen to forego food and you force it upon them, in my opinion, you would be committing a crime in that scenario. And so does a surrogate have the ability to say, this person does not want to be touched or fed in that way, and therefore you can't do it? I think that's probably your best legal argument, to say that voluntary feeding or voluntary refusal to eat is a right, and you're forcing food upon me would be a crime. And therefore, I don't think any nursing home would be obligated to commit a crime in order to accomplish the feeding responsibility. Most of the laws designed to stop feeding would be to stop involuntary feeding, malnutrition, or non-feeding as punishment, I guess. But the law, I don't think, assumed that that would be clients voluntarily refusing to eat. In fact, Florida law has ruled that in prison scenarios where individuals refuse to eat as a form of protest, the prison cannot intervene and force them to eat. So again, that's presumptively a competent person making the decision not to eat, but the law does support that conceptually. Another issue that's raised often is it, in Florida we call it assisted self-murder. They don't say physician-assisted suicide or assisted suicide. So you can see there might be a little bias in the law there. And so, the question comes up is your participation in VSED an assisted suicide? I would argue that it's not under the law, because the law doesn't really contemplate the refusing to intervene. What the law says is if you actively participate in the assistance of suicide, that you may be held responsible for that and that it's a crime. But your simple refusal to intervene in what is otherwise the body's natural process of dying through not eating is probably not likely to be ruled assisting in suicide. Is it neglect or abuse? Again, I would argue that no, under the law, simply honoring a patient's wishes not to eat is not going to be found to be neglect or abuse in a nursing home setting. And then I think there are a few unresolved concerns. If a client is incompetent or a patient is incompetent, when does that incompetent person's rights end? If you are 12 days into a 16-day process and the person gestures to their mouth and points to a cup, which person do you honor? Do you honor the competent individual who chose to voluntarily withhold that treatment when they had the capacity to do that? Or do you honor the individual in front of you at that moment who may or may not be indicating to be fed or get hydration? And I don't think the law is clear on that, and that's probably the kind of case that's going to be required before this develops into a real body of law that we can rely on. So that's one issue I think that's unresolved, and it's true in every scenario, not just voluntarily withholding nutrition or hydration, but in any area where an incompetent individual potentially indicates they've changed their mind. And where's that line drawn? Because unless a guardianship is in place, an individual retains their rights to make those decisions up until the moment of death. Another issue I think that is outstanding is, could Florida's laws regarding involuntary institutionalization due to mental illness intervene in a scenario where this is an option? Is there sufficient evidence of a mental illness or depression or some intervening factor in which someone could try to pursue involuntarily institutionalizing you to treat you for the underlying issues? And how does your right to self-determination impact there? And I think it's probably a question of competence at the time, which the courts would have to determine, or the doctors. So we'll pass it on. I'm sure we'll get into it more. Thank you.
Dr. Angston?
Carrie called me to talk a little bit about her friend Dorothy. And as a physician, as a humanitarian, my heart really went out because in my limited scope of practice dealing with end of life, I can tell you that dying, as I mentioned in the article, is not like it is in the movies. There's a fair amount of work involved. And it can be very, very hard. Tidewell exists as a community resource, however, so I encouraged Carrie to plug into some of our bereavement resources, but I know you have lots of people around you, and that was a good thing. I wanted to explain a little bit about hospice and how hospice works. You need to understand that as I work in hospice, hospice is two things. It is a medical approach to care, as well as a system of payment whereby you elect your hospice benefit through your Medicare benefit. It is a right each of us has once we become Medicare beneficiaries to avail ourselves to 6 months of good end-of-life care, which is based upon a team approach, meaning as a physician, I am no longer the end-all, be-all. I am part of a team that includes social work, nursing, chaplaincy, spiritual care. So when Carrie came to me and asked me about this case, I was a little lost because I didn't have my people around me. From a medical point of view, Dorothy couldn't access her hospice Medicare benefit in part because, by definition, in order to do so, you have to be determined to have a terminal condition, by which it means if it goes along its natural course, it's very likely that you will succumb or die, thank you, Dr. Black, within 6 months. In our community, when people access that hospice benefit, on average, they are able to avail themselves to that for 10.5 days. So we're not doing a very good job of that so far. The other thing that I think is so interesting is because of my work, I get to see, in part, what it looks like from a natural point of view. And I think this is so interesting, right? Because 100 years ago, when your family member took to bed, it was a part of the natural fabric of what would happen. But we have medicalized everything. And there's always another something that we can do, which is a wonderful thing. We live in a fantastic time. But this is the first generation that's really been confronted with these complicated issues. John and I talk about this. These advance directives and living wills, they're pages and pages, and yet they can't possibly put down every single scenario that might happen to us. So that's why those conversations with the people who might represent you, if you can't speak for yourself, are actually probably even more important than having that piece of paper. So I would encourage all of us, if you do nothing else when you leave here, just have a conversation about, I've been thinking about how I would like it to be for me. The other thing that I think is so interesting about hospice is that it started as a social movement. It really is about autonomy and choice, and about choosing sometimes not to take the typical route, taking instead the option to spend quality time, to not fill up my dance card with more doctor's appointments and the like. It's not an easy choice to make, and the decisions aren't always black and white, but it is part of what you have a right to in terms of your access. It's not always simple. One of the things that I get to witness as a part of this is how we are as human beings in a human system. When I think about my own end and contemplate really time of disability, because most of us don't get it like in the movies, right? Only 10% of us die suddenly. For most of us, it's going to be a lot of work, and it's going to be small bits and pieces of us that we lose over time. And I think about that. I no longer think about that with the dread I used to when I was an internist and a pediatrician. Now, as somebody who's witnessed this with families time and again, I see that there's the possibility of some wonderful growth and development as human people that we don't get to unless we're dependent. Has anybody in this room received caregiving at any time in their life? You should all be raising your hands because you did not raise yourselves as infants, I'm pretty sure. When we were that age, it was normal to be dependent. It was natural, it was assumed, and we weren't thought of as less of, right? We were just people. And I would love to get to a point in our culture where the idea of dependence at end of life isn't the end, but the beginning of something new.
Good afternoon. My name is Miriam, and Joelle is going to be with me at the bitter end, and she knows that. Although I will tell you, as a psychotherapist, and I live in a world of denial very often, and I've made a decision I'm just not going to die. There's much too much to do. It seems like such a waste of time, and therefore I might just decide that I'm going to continue on and figure that out. So I'm very clear about my own denial, and I'm very comfortable with it. Despite that, over the years, I've chaired things like the End of Life Coalition and Loss Grief bereavement committees, and we've put on National Healthcare Decision Day. Part of that is my theory is that the more I acquaint myself with the part of my life I don't want to talk about, the better I will hopefully accept it in the end. So that's my theory. Part of my theory also is I love that John used the word gray a number of times. I live in the gray world, meaning that as a psychotherapist, I deal with your emotions, the amorphic part of yourself. You know, Einstein theoretically seemed to think that the mind was somewhere outside of the brain. I always envisioned him with a net that you would catch butterflies, trying to capture the mind, and I thought it was always very humorous to me until finally now we're on the new frontier of neuroscience, and we are finally figuring out that our brain is responsible for absolutely everything that happens for the bunch of chemicals that we are. But my world is so entrenched in the gray, in your feelings, in your emotions, in who you are, that is not captured by the law. It is not captured by the science of medicine. It is captured, while it is in your brain and generated there, I deal with your heart, not as a cardiologist, but rather as the feelings that emanate from that part of you. Suicide is another one of those words we don't like to talk about. As a mental health provider, I have Baker Acted any number of people, Baker Act being a court order into treatment. And I will tell you that the Baker Act really relies on, is that person suicidal or homicidal? That is basically what is in that law. And when I have Baker Acted individuals, it is never without going home at night believing I have denied someone of their rights, even though at that moment in time I was convinced that they could not decide for themselves and therefore execute that particular order. But I do want you to know that those of us who do that, it is never taken lightly. It is always a terrible moment when you think that you are taking something away from another person. Suicide, again, is a very interesting topic. If I look back at the Romans and Greeks, actually committing suicide was laudable, and it was seen as something noble in gesture when someone was going to make that effort. We have morphed into a very interesting society. We're not allowed to use that word. We're not allowed to use death, as Kathy implied. We're supposed to pretend, and I don't want to promote the pretending that we seem to have engaged in. So therefore, I want to use the word suicide. I want to use those words. One thing I will tell you I've learned for over a period of time, one really wise person said to me when I didn't have gray hair a long time ago, that people kill themselves not because they want to die. They kill themselves because they can no longer tolerate the pain. It is a pain that I don't know. I'm not familiar with it because, as I said, I want to live forever. But I have met people who have that extraordinary, exquisite pain, that they are whole and healthy, they are competent, they are capable, but yet their capacity to live in a world where they don't see a way to be hopeful, they don't see options, they don't see how to believe that they can function in this world. I need to respect that. I really need to see that very differently than perhaps the authorities do. But I also know that if a person is incapacitated by a mental illness, if we have chronic depression, if we have a person who really can't make that decision, then we are in another place in our reality. So this is a highly debatable subject. It is not one that is a fine line of decision making. It cannot be. And I'm imagining that as I look around this audience, you each have your very own personal perspective about suicide and what it really means. The tragedy of suicide, beyond the individual, if that individual really is unable to make peace with their world, are those of us who are left behind in that wake. That is the struggle emotionally. That when we see someone suffer to that degree, or in the case of what Carrie wrote, someone who said, my quality of life was pretty amazing, it's not there anymore, and at this point I am making a conscious decision that I want to remember that part of my life and I want to move on. But again, for those of us who remain, that emotional conundrum can be fierce within us. And when I've worked with parents who lose their children to suicide, or if a spouse loses a spouse, or a child loses an adult, making peace with that never happens. I'm one of those therapists, I don't believe in closure. There's no such thing. In my world, we always grieve for someone we've loved. We grieve for a pet that we had who defined our lives. We always grieve. There's no such thing as closure, and I go ape about that because I don't get it. We grieve in different degrees. We are sad in different degrees. Our sadness ebbs and wanes. That's what it does. That's our emotional selves. And when someone leaves us that we've loved, how do we ever truly make peace with that? We can get on with our lives to a certain degree, but the way we get on with that is going to be very personally defined. Again, because of the existential nature of ourselves, our emotional selves, our feeling selves, is going to dictate how we are in our world. So enough said there. I bet questions and answers are bubbling up, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you to all the panelists who were brilliant in bringing up some really important points, and I'm sure you're all interested now in getting answered the questions that you have. The method here is going to be, if you have a question, if you could step to that podium over there and speak your question into the microphone clearly there. If you want to direct it toward a particular panelist, you may. I'm happy to answer questions about the story if you have questions about that, but I would like to say just before we start that we aren't necessarily here to debate what's right or what's wrong, or whether what Dorothy did was right or wrong, because whatever you believe is the best death is absolutely valid for you, and not necessarily for the person next to you who may come from a completely different perspective. So I just ask everybody to be respectful of everyone else's positions and opinions, and we'd love to provide you with the wealth of information that these panelists can supply. We'll also have a handout at the end of our time today that'll give you some other resources, places where you can get further or perhaps more detailed information. So please make your way to the podium if you have a question. Hopefully we'll have lots of them and we'll get a good discussion going.
I would just like to address. Yes.
I forgot that they asked that you please state your name and where you're from, city that you're from, before you start speaking. Thank you.
My name is Dale Reith. I live at Lake House Retirement Facility on Beneva Road. I've lived there since 1999. My wife of 58 years died last July. I first met her when she was a freshman in high school, and I was a freshman in college. And her mother used to always tell me that in those days they called it persistence, and now they call it stalking. Yeah. So we were very close. In 1999, she had a brain aneurysm, and I took it upon myself to try to care for her by myself for about 3 years. And after that, I felt as time passed, that my family and I were completely betrayed by the medical profession and hospice. Every place I would take her, I was led to believe that they could make her better than she was. And usually that's what happened. But slowly over time, she did not do as well as she did in the past. Till finally, since she was handicapped on top of all of this, I dropped her in trying to transfer her in the bathroom to a wheelchair. And in so doing, it turned out that her leg was broken. So she went to a facility to take care of her. And again, I expected that everything was going to be okay. And no one said otherwise. None of the doctors, none of the nurses, none of the hospice people. So,
So Dale, I just want to make sure we have time for everyone.
Just
Do you have a question
I've
that you'd
finished,
like to
yes.
ask? Okay, great.
I had her in a facility here in Sarasota, and on a Thursday of one week, they called me into the caseworker's office and told me they were going to discharge my wife on Monday. I said, "What do you mean you're going to discharge her?" I said, "What's the problem?" And they said, "Well, we think she should go to hospice." I said, "What the hell do you mean, go to hospice?" I brought her here expecting that she would be better. Again, no one said anything otherwise. I said, "I'm not going to put up with this. I'm going to take her home, on Saturday instead of waiting until Monday," which I did. Hospice came right away, and by the following Thursday, 1 week later, she was dead. And again, I went to the doctors and I said, "Why didn't you say something to us, prepare us in some way that this was going to happen?" And it was inexcusable. We had done every legal preparation that we were told to do all along the line. And all I'm saying to this audience is don't rely entirely upon what you're hearing today, because you're very likely going to be let down.
Dr. Angston, did you want to speak to that, please? Thank you, Dale.
Is really common. And the thing is that as a profession, physicians are very bad at prognostication, meaning predicting the future. And part of that is because as human beings, we're individuals and we don't always follow those curves. The other thing to understand is the hospice benefit is really based upon a cancer trajectory or a cancer illness where you have sort of a nice sloping curve. When you have other illnesses, such as heart disease or lung disease or any myriad of other things, the disease often goes a little stepwise, and it's harder to predict. So it can be really hard to access that hospice benefit if you're kind of waiting for an event to happen and you don't know when that is going to happen. So part of, I think, what ought to be the current social movement for hospice is to demand that we start to look at illnesses for what they really are and not what we wish they would be. And the other thing to understand is our systems of care are fractured, not broken, but they don't communicate to each other. And so we try very hard as individual practitioners to get people where they need to be and what they need and when they need to have it. But there are systems of payment set up such that, well, you can only go into rehab if people think you're rehabilitatable, and you can only access your hospice benefit if 2 physicians think you're within the last 6 months. There are systems set up in place in part because we have a small economic concern there, and that can be really hard. And yes, when people come to me, by definition, As a hospice physician, they haven't necessarily been ecstatic with the care that they've received. By and large, all the people that I minister to are disappointed that they didn't get what they wanted. And you didn't get what you wanted, and you certainly didn't get what you deserved.
If I could add, if that's all right. I also think it's partly the language we use in communicating with our providers, our care providers. You know, I think that there's a legal reason that doctors don't say you've got 2 months to live or 6 days or 6 months. Part of that's because they don't know. They don't want to. You know, they don't know. They don't want to commit themselves to something that turns out not to be true. The other side of that is that they don't necessarily want to be the bearers of bad news every day. Sorry, Bob, you've got 6 months. Just wanted to let you know, and we'll see you next month for your follow-up. So, you know, the part of the conversation that we encourage people to have in that kind of scenario is say, not when am I going to die, how much time do I have left, but would you be surprised if I was here next year or 6 months from now or 1 month from now? Because doctors might be more willing to commit to language that's not quite so definitive as to paint them in a corner legally. Yeah.
One of the reasons that we aren't so good at this is the longer we know you, the less good at it we are. All right? So if that doesn't speak to the connection that physicians have with their patients, I don't know what does.
And I like what you say about they don't, you know, would you be surprised to hear?
Yeah,
Because
they
actually,
hear
you.
I've been saying that Dorothy actually turned that around. And she's the one, the physician said, see you next year, and she said, I hope not. I don't think I'm going to be here next year.
I just want to say quickly, I was at an international conference on palliative and end-of-life care. There were over 40 countries presented there. The entire industrialized world is dealing with medicalized deaths and these issues. And in England today, they have the gold question, and the physicians are to ask for each patient, would you be surprised if that patient dies in the upcoming year? And if the answer to that is no, then a whole series of things are put into place. Every country is struggling with this right now.
Thank you. Our next question.
My name is Brian Hunter. I'm from Sarasota. I think the question would be to Kathy. You mentioned the European countries allowing the opiates. I was in Amsterdam recently and actually spoke to one of their attorneys. The attorney mentioned you have to have a passport. Do you know if that's necessarily true? If I was an American, could I go to one of those countries and use one of the facilities?
Everybody here to watch the PBS show on Frontline. You can stream it for free, the PBS show called The Suicide Tourist. The film will change your life. It has moved everybody. It is free, and you can download it and watch it yourself. In the story, a man with ALS travels there. They do not say whether he has a passport. He's actually, believe it or not, he's American, but he's living in England at the time. But it is the most profound piece you will ever watch, and it will change you in so many ways to watch the film. So I can't say, but I do know that they have limits to, you also need a terminal diagnosis. The film is called The Suicide Tourist. Now, if you want to also watch The Suicide Plan on Frontline, that film, also on Frontline free and downloadable, talks about the Final Exit Network. So I encourage you to watch that one as well. It's also very good and very interesting, but The Suicide Tourist is very, very profound.
Kathy, maybe, or you or Jim could explain briefly what the Final Exit Network is, in case someone doesn't know. Everybody knows.
Jim?
I was asking Jim Chastain, who's the president of the Final Exit Network in Florida, if he could just briefly explain what the Final Exit Network does, in case some people don't know.
Final Exit Network counsels people who are thinking about ending their lives. And frequently we get a question about going to Europe. And I think you do have to have, Switzerland is the only place where a person can go today and die without being a citizen of that country. But it is a possibility to do tourist deaths in Switzerland.
Thank you, Jim. I've got to have everybody ask questions. I'll get you next. Is that okay? All right. Thank you.
People in line over here.
Okay. If you can take a seat over there if you like. There's a sit. No, please do.
I'm Susan Love. I now live in Sarasota. I moved here 6 months ago. I'm a retired RN, and every job that I've had through oncology, psychiatry, and case management of medically complex children have involved end-of-life issues across the board. Plus, I've been the primary caregiver for my parents, my husband, and was a consultant for my in-laws in making decisions. To me, this is a whole cultural issue that is critical. It's driven me crazy for years that we can't talk about it. And it's other than being born, it's the most important thing that hangs over us until it happens. It's a communication thing that has to evolve. And my question is, I would like to be part of the dialogue, and I'm not sure where to go to volunteer to work with people who are also very aware of the same issues and would like to participate.
One thing I can say is April 16th of every year is National Healthcare Decision Day. It started in the state of Virginia. It was a statewide initiative, and now it's national, and this will be the 7th annual. It was the 16th was chosen because April 15th is tax day, and according to Benjamin Franklin, nothing is certain in life as what? There you go. And so it was started by a healthcare attorney who realized, and I can tell you from being in the hospital as well, people coming in and never thinking about this, and yet all the red flags were there that they should have thought about it. And so it's an attempt, it's a national attempt. So if you go to nationalhealthcaredecisionday.org, and I took that one out, but it's nationalhealthcaredecisionday.org, and NHDD, you will find it, and there'll be a lot of opportunities. His plan was that the day would become so inundated with advanced care planning that you would go to your grocery stores, your libraries, that it would be everywhere. Particularly leading would be the healthcare organizations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Jack Ferrante. I'm a retired counselor from Maryland. I vacation here in Sarasota, and I do volunteer work at assisted living homes where I can carry on some of my experiences as a counselor, trying to help people. And this is my question. First of all, Carrie, thank you for an excellent article. It really was a masterpiece.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And you did mention, let's not talk about pros and cons of what Dorothy should have or Dorothy shouldn't have, but it does tie in some with my question. Dorothy was a unique person when we stop and think of born in Japan, a life led throughout the entire world, and a fullness that goes beyond anyone's capacity. I mean, a fullness that is wow to dream of. At the same time, she had a son who committed suicide, another son who died in a canoe accident not far from where I live. At the same time, a husband who dies of cancer. And I have to ask myself, when she made this decision, was she fully capable, or had something set in when she had to contrast these two extremes in her life, of fullness here and an emptiness here, to incapacitate her, I would say? And was she capable? That is the question. And I ask this question because if we say this is okay and it's going to be commonplace, what are some of the images we can imagine in the future where this is happening on a regular basis? I don't know to what extent a decision like that was made where a person was fully capable of making such a decision.
There are criteria for capacity, and they include being aware of what you're saying, being able to repeat it over and over, that it's consistent with your life values. In the story that I read, and again, we're not here to examine Dorothy, she clearly was fully with capacity. And there are legal and clinical indicators of that. I just want to say regarding the losses, people as they age face multiple, cumulative, and irreplaceable losses. And it is not easy, and yet many people do transcend it, and they are able to go ahead. The issue of whether she should have been treated for depression, people have the right to refuse medical treatment. How many people do we know who have symptoms who should be seen but don't? Nobody can be forced to go. In my conversations with Arthur Kaplan, he did call it a rational suicide. And he agreed, as well as his colleague, agreed that everything that could have been offered to her to support her, to encourage her to live, should have been done, and it looks like it certainly was, but the decision was ultimately hers. But from the story that I read, she was fully with capacity.
And I just want to also mention that at the Sunrise Assisted Living, where I volunteer, there were about 85 patients, and about a dozen of them I work with on a one-to-one basis in terms of trying to cheer them up, whatever. But what is amazing is how from day to day, they're different people. One day they'll be yelling and screaming at me, "What do you know about anything?" And the next day they want to hug me and kiss me. And there are times when depression has set in, like, I don't want to live. Another day is, wow, you got me smiling. We're singing. We're doing a little Irish jig here. Wow.
I would like to, as someone who knew Dorothy fairly well, I would just like to point out, and I'm not judging anything because I wouldn't presume to judge, but Dorothy did have tremendous loss in her life. The amazing thing about Dorothy was she reinvented, those losses happened in the 80s and 70s. She reinvented herself after all that happened. That's when she started her traveling and her service learning and her volunteering and her slideshows. So it may be the case that she didn't grieve sufficiently for the losses that she had, but she had wonderful quality of life even after those losses. She felt that she was going downhill, both physically and Dorothy was an intensely private person. She did not share her thoughts about her sons or her losses. But she had a distinctly un-American idea about death and view of death. And this was not something that she decided just because she couldn't travel anymore or for any other single reason. Dorothy had thought about this for a really long time. From the time I first knew her, we had talked about how she viewed end of life and how she did not want to have a slow dive into incompetency. So, and those of you, several people have said, well, you were her friend, why didn't you get her to a mental health counselor? I probably was one of the only people brave enough to say to Dorothy, maybe you're depressed. And she wouldn't countenance it. And there are a couple members of her team in the room today, and I know that they would back me up 100% when I say we all felt she was completely competent. Whether she was suffering from some form of depression, I'm not qualified to answer that. To me, as someone who's a 2-time cancer survivor, I feel like if you can't find any reason to be happy to be alive, that is depression in some form. But that's my judgment, you know? I feel like she was totally competent to make this decision, and she would not hear of anyone swaying her in any way.
And if I could say, in my practice, if a week goes by where someone doesn't say, some gentleman usually, that when that's me, when I can't make those decisions, I'm going to take care of it. I hear that every week. If it's one time, that's probably rare. It's more than that. And the reality is, what happens in most cases is, you know, incapacity robs you of your decision-making process. So you decide today that you're not going to be here to worry about it then, but when you have dementia, you forget you thought that way. And so, you know, to impose that there is some judgment about that decision-making, you know, I'm not the person to do that. I think people legitimately feel they are going to do that. You know, I guess the line between whether it's cowardice or courage, you know, you have to draw for yourself. But a lot of clients have that. Fully competent people, I think, have a legitimate plan to end their life before it's robbed from them. So what did it say? Everyone dies, but not everyone lives, right? So, you know, it's a personal decision. And so, you know, I don't know what the line is. You have to make that for yourself. And if you plan to make that for yourself, you have to make it clear to your surrogates, because if that's truly your plan, you may not have the capacity to make that at the time. And that's why those advance directives and having that well thought out in advance is going to be essential. I'll tell you, I had a client in my office this week. Of course, I was thinking about all of this coming up, and he sat with me and said, I'm letting you know that I plan to commit suicide. Now, suicide's not a crime, so I have no obligation to report that. But it's still difficult for me to hear, even though I hear it all the time, because in this gentleman's case, he means it. He's got prostate cancer, has rejected traditional medical treatment, has decided that he doesn't want to follow through with the end stages of that illness. And so he's decided, I've already got the cord. I've already got the hose. He's going to do it by carbon monoxide poisoning, I guess. You know, what is my obligation? Am I to talk him out of it? You know, is that the role of an advisor to say, hey, wait, I don't agree, or you shouldn't do this, or you're depressed, or, you know, that's a decision he's making. He's got other advisors, but ultimately it's not the law's job to impose a life on you that you don't want. And so I think if that's your wishes, you need to make those very clear.
Thank you, John. Good point. And I will say that Dorothy, the reason she made her decision when she made it was because she didn't want to get in a situation where she could no longer make it.
My name is Catherine Gerard, and I'm, like John, an elder law attorney in town. And there are three kind of short questions that I would like to ask, but I would like to give a little context for the questions. But my first question is to ask Carrie if Dorothy knew that you were going to write this article.
Yes, she did. As a matter of fact, she was very enthusiastic about it. We talked about it after she had told me of her decision, her choice of what she was going to do, and she was as enthusiastic about it as I was, probably more so. And her motivation, she really did think that our way of dealing with death in our culture was misguided, and she felt like this could be a service that she could provide from her death to get people talking and thinking about the subject. So yes, I interviewed her twice before she died.
Well, I'm sure that people could interpret some of where I might come down based on my comments leading up to the questions, but in truth, I make no moral or ethical judgment for anybody else. But I would like to say that my reading of that article is that Dorothy was motivated by power, by pride, and by control. Now, whether or not those are considered good qualities, neutral qualities, or negative qualities, not for me to make a judgment. But that's what I think was motivating there. I think the thing that punched me in the stomach, and that will be my largest takeaway from that article, is not about Dorothy herself, but the fact that all of her team members said they would never participate in such a thing again.
But not because they disagreed that Dorothy had the right to do it. I just wanted to make that clear.
I fully accept that. But I think we all need to ponder, without asking them, what that might have been like for them. But I think that is a very, very significant part of that article. The other thing that I would like to say, and lead to sort of a question, is that as John has talked about, I too see people week in and week out who will say, no, I don't want any of that. When I'm ready to go, I'm going to go. And I've been doing it long enough, so I have seen some of them go. And I really don't know whether it's because of the medical situations that they run into, or the person that they have named as their surrogate, or whether it is just our very deep-seated instinct to live, that the vast majority of them do not go out the way those living wills or, advance directives say. And the doctor from Tidewell, I would like to ask about the fact that, and it's not the first time that I've heard it, that people spend such a very short time in hospice, and why that message doesn't get out sooner, only prefacing it with my own thought that that is another indicator of the fact that people's instinct to live is enormous, and it is only when it's like there's just absolutely no hope that then they turn to hospice, and how very sad that can be.
I will say that, hospice it really is about choices, and it's about living those last days as full as you can. And yet it's so hard for people to access that because they associate it with the very last hours or days. And even for people in my profession, when you see over and over again what somebody looks like at a week and a half out, it's very hard to conceptualize what someone may look like at 6 months. And, we talk about the process of dying like it's very clear cut, and it's not. It's never always. There's some nuances, and it's complicated, and it's messy. So, for example, you have a wonderful, wonderful woman patient with breast cancer. When did she perhaps start to die if we take care of her? Was it when she first got diagnosed 25 years ago? Was it when she had her first recurrence 5 years ago? When was that? Was it with her very last pneumonia? I mean, I've had conversations with people over the bedside when people are saying, well, you said that there's a pneumonia there, which, by the way, used to be called the old man's friend. How come you're letting them die of pneumonia when what they have is cancer? And we don't have a good understanding for what that process and its normal should look like. And so there's always something to do, and people often, as you mentioned, because perhaps of that instinct, because families are making decisions and they don't want to be the last one burdened, that I made the decision not to treat mom's infection.
Then I would recommend that everybody in this room, if they haven't read it, go get an old book, meaning 20 years old, by Sherwin Newland called How We Die. And he just died himself. I believe he was in his 80s, and he was a surgeon at Yale New Haven Hospital when he wrote this book. And I guess my challenge back would be, the medical community knows more how to answer the question that you're speaking about. And I think that none of us would say the woman who 25 years ago had her first instance of breast cancer is ready for hospice. But I don't think that all of the decisions are that clear cut.
Right,
my
they're-
personal self, and that we could help people a lot more if we engaged them in conversation and helped people to feel that it is a more natural process.
Thank you.
I agree. And I just want to say, as a physician, the first time that I took care of someone in what I would consider a natural death was when I worked at hospice. I had to attend a lot of autopsies. I ran a lot of codes in order to be stamped an MD and practice. But I was never asked to sit by somebody's bed as they passed. I didn't even know what that looked like. We haven't normalized that. We haven't talked about it in medical school. It doesn't exist. My first experience with death as a fourth-year med student was in the emergency room, and we simply pulled the curtain. That was it. So yes, we have a really long way to go, but some of the reason that physicians don't understand this process and don't talk to you about it is because they have so little experience. We don't have the language. We don't know what to say once we've done all these curative things. Well, that's when we can shine the most, I think, but we haven't yet talked about that and engaged physicians about that.
Can I just add something that's coming up for me? Two things. One is, you mentioned the conversation. You know, beyond all the wonderful work that John does with the papers, I'm going to encourage every one of you to have a conversation with someone you trust to carry out your wishes. Those conversations are so powerful and so vital for someone to understand what you really want, emotionally, physically, psychologically. The other thing is, because of John again, John's my buddy, my pal, John is really big on ethical wills. And what I did was, very briefly, I had a person come in and film me for 45 minutes, and I made a DVD for my son. It was extemporaneous. It was telling my son my values, some history, some of our roots, so that he has that when I die, so that he can look back and have something that really speaks to him beyond whatever he inherits physically. It's the inheritance of who his mother is emotionally, psychologically, ethically, morally. And I'm going to encourage each one of you, write it out or have it filmed, but leave that to the people that you love, that they have something that they also know that you really cared about in your life. It's really, really important.
Thank you, Miriam. That's great advice. I'm getting the signal that we only have about 5 minutes left. I'd say maybe if we're speedy, we could take 2 more questions. And the woman in the green shirt who's just about to walk out, she's been waiting from the beginning, and she just happened to be on the wrong side of the room. So we'll take your question, and then we'll take hers. And if we run out of time, we are having a forum on Thursday at the Venice Library at 2 o'clock. If any of you can come down for that one, we'd love to have you join us for that one as well.
Hi, I'm Diane Dessenberg from Sarasota. And I was wondering if somebody who's in Dorothy's position, who's decided on VSED to stop eating and drinking to hasten their death, somebody who has decided to voluntarily stop eating and drinking to hasten their death, if that would be a basis for being Baker acted. So assuming there's no terminal illness, maybe their healthcare surrogate isn't strong enough acting on in practice, would that happen?
In my opinion, no, it would not. I don't think you would have the legal basis to involuntarily remove that person from their setting, remove them of their rights to make medical decisions for themselves without some very obvious underlying evidence that they can't make that decision competently.
Correct.
So I would say no, she would not be subject to a Baker Act.
That's right.
And if I could add to that, I've had a little experience I have a loved one who was Baker acted. And I can tell you that if anyone had been successful in getting Dorothy Baker acted, they would have dismissed her within an hour. There's no way they would have kept her. Okay.
Thank you. It was a long wait. My name is Pamela Hallbeck, and I'm a 6-month Wisconsin, Florida snowbird. My question would be directed to Mr. Griffith. Is there anybody actively pursuing the legal ability to do assisted suicide in the state of Florida? And who would, and how is it, if so, is it working? Is it moving forward? And who would be a legislator that one could work with or support toward that end?
And actually, this question probably isn't best directed to me. I imagine one of Carrie or Kathy may know better.
The only thing I'll say is the last state to add it was New Mexico, and it happened after a VSED story that was the front page of the New York Times about a year ago. It was a couple, they were 88 and 92, and they had been having a continuing deteriorating health course, fully with capacity, told their children that this is how they were going to do it. They both wanted to die, and they were about 4 days into it. They were living at an assisted living facility, and the assisted living facility found out about it and called the police, called the emergency room. Again, it was the front page of the New York Times. Then they gave them an order that they needed to leave, and the son said, look, we've got a 30-day notice here. They ended up leaving, and the couple did die soon afterwards, but New Mexico soon created the policy after that. And I think that maybe some sort of event may have to be the precipitating thing to move this state along in doing it. But as I said at the beginning, physician-assisted suicide, we prefer the term physician-assisted dying, but even in that case, it is for people with terminal illness. There are safeguards in place. You need to make, you need to say that that's what you want at least a few weeks apart, orally and in writing. You need to have a terminal diagnosis. You need to find a physician who can do it for you. You need to be a resident of the state, and that would not have served the needs of Dorothy.
Right. Also, I am also a retired registered nurse. I have seen a lot of people die. It's just too bad we don't have all the means if we choose to have them, would be my final word. Thank you. And thank you for doing the program.
Do we have time for one more?
My name's Klaus Obermatt. I'm from Sarasota. I knew Dorothy for 10 years, and I wanted to address the question of, was Dorothy with capacity? Because I was called when Dorothy started her 2 weeks of not eating or drinking, and I had a chance to chat with her after she had just started for 1 day. I knew Dorothy, and I saw her on a weekly basis, sometimes several times a week. I worked with her, and she had capacity. She knew what she was doing. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I cannot judge professionally on whether she was depressed, but I knew her for that period of time, and she certainly did not seem depressed to me. I was not a member of her team, though, I will say that. She did tell me that she had a physical condition, and she was deteriorating, and she knew where this was headed, and she did not want to go there, and that's why she decided to do what she did. She told me that many of her friends were supportive. A few of them were upset and said she should not do it, and this bothered her. So she was determined.
I'm sorry, but we're going to run out of time.
Right.
I do appreciate your elucidating Dorothy's situation, which I think just underscores that for every person, it's very individual. It's very very much your own perspective and your own decision making. And Dorothy was the person who said that it was a control issue. Dorothy was nothing if not controlling. So I think that was fairly accurate without any judgment put on that. But I want to thank you all for being here today. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions. The thing that I would really underscore is it's very hopeful to me that we've all responded to this topic, and we've all seen how important it is that we keep the conversation going. Please feel free to share the link for the Dorothy story to anyone who you think might be interested in joining in the conversation, and let's try to keep it alive. Thank you. Make sure you get a handout on the way out for resources. Thank you for coming.